December 10th, 1941, Truk Lagoon, deep in the heart of the Caroline Islands. The sun hammered the steel decks of the Japanese cruiser Chikuma, glinting off polished brass and the dark uniforms of officers standing at attention. Smoke from cigarettes curled lazily into the tropical air, mixing with the salty scent of the ocean. Laughter echoed across the water, a sound filled with arrogance, with confidence born of victories that had seemed unstoppable. The officers had just received fresh intelligence, reports of U.S. submarine movements in the Pacific. They barely contained their amusement. Tiny submarines, they said. Small, underpowered, barely able to dive. Toy boats, one officer whispered to another, grinning. They cannot challenge the Imperial Navy. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue smirked, flicking ash into the ocean. In his mind, the war had already been decided. America's Navy had been dealt a crippling blow at Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned in the harbor. Aircraft carriers, although spared, were scattered. How could a handful of small submarines possibly threaten an empire that spanned thousands of miles of ocean? That was the thought echoing through every Japanese admiral's mind at the time. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, a different kind of war was beginning, invisible to those laughing officers. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush Morton stood in the cramped conning tower of the USS Wahoo, his eyes scanning the dark waters for signs of enemy vessels. Diesel engines thrummed beneath his feet, the vibrations steady, almost hypnotic. His crew, young, disciplined, and tense, waited for his command. Every sonar ping, every faint echo, every subtle shift in the water was potential danger, potential opportunity. Morton adjusted the periscope, narrowing his vision on a silhouette emerging in the night. A Japanese freighter, moving slowly, unaware of the hunter beneath the waves. Enemy transport, whispered his executive officer, voice tight with anticipation. Morton's fingers danced over the controls. 4 torpedoes launched with a hiss, cutting through the water silently. Seconds stretched like hours as the crew watched. Then the ocean erupted, fire, smoke, and the twisted hull of the transport sinking bow first into the abyss. The men in the Wahoo exhaled collectively, a mixture of relief and exhilaration. They didn't yet know it, but this was just the first ripple in a wave that would eventually strangle Japan's empire. These toy submarines were about to prove that war could be won not by size or prestige, but by persistence, stealth, and lethal precision. The Japanese admirals, of course, could not have imagined it. Their early victories had blinded them to the relentless industrial and tactical machinery forming quietly in American shipyards. The Gato-class submarines, designed for range, endurance, and firepower, were being produced faster than anyone had predicted. Men like Morton and his peers were trained to strike without warning, to vanish into the depths before the enemy even realized what had happened. While Japan focused on battleships and aircraft carriers, the U.S. Navy quietly built an invisible armada beneath the waves, a silent killer that would systematically dismantle Japan's logistical lifelines. By 1942, impact became impossible to ignore. Japanese shipping lanes, once considered secure, were being systematically attacked. Tankers, freighters, and even heavily escorted transports were falling prey to American submarines. Gato-class boats, though small and unimposing, carried the weight of an entire strategic doctrine. The Navy's tactical innovations, wolfpack tactics, coordinated patrols, improved torpedo reliability, allowed these submarines to operate far beyond what Japanese intelligence had predicted. A single boat could destroy dozens of ships over a single deployment, cutting vital fuel and supplies to an empire that depended on them for survival. On the decks of the cruiser Chikuma, the laughter of the admirals was replaced with confusion and frustration. Reports arrived daily of missing convoys, destroyed freighters, and inexplicable sinkings hundreds of miles from combat zones. "How can this be?" muttered Rear Admiral Nobutake Kondo, eyes wide with disbelief. Radar, sonar, and diligent American planning had made these toy submarines a nightmare that no amount of fleet concentration could easily fix. For the first time, Japan's naval leadership began to grasp that the Pacific Ocean, once considered their playground, was turning against them in subtle but deadly ways. Submarine patrol after patrol demonstrated a brutal calculus. Japan once moved men, fuel, and raw materials with impunity. Now every shipment was a gamble with survival. In 1943, U.S. Navy submarines sank over 1 million tons of Japanese ships in a single year alone. Merchant vessels that had been essential to feeding and fueling Japan's forces vanished beneath the waves. One by one, the once dismissed Gato-class boats were now shaping the strategic outcome of the war, cutting off Japan's ability to project power and sustain occupation across the Pacific. The story was not only about technology or firepower, it was about endurance and the human element. Submariners lived under constant threat, depth charges pounding, enemy aircraft overhead, crushing pressure of the deep. Life aboard a Gato-class submarine was claustrophobic, terrifying, and exhausting. Every patrol required nerves of steel, split-second decision-making, and an unwavering focus on the mission. Their success was a testament not just to design, but to the men who braved the depth day after day, knowing the ocean itself could claim them at any moment. Across the Pacific, Japanese commanders began to adjust, slowly realizing that their traditional focus on surface fleet engagements was insufficient. Escorts were increased, convoys rerouted, anti-submarine measures intensified, but it was too little, too late. The logistical backbone of Japan was crumbling, and for every freighter saved, 2 more sank. The admirals who had once mocked these toys now confronted a terrifying reality. The American submarines were not just sinking ships, they were eroding the very foundations of Japan's war machine. Morton and his contemporaries pressed the advantage, moving stealthily from patrol to patrol. They became shadows, striking in the dead of night, exploiting intelligence, and striking at the arteries that fed Japan's empire. By mid-1944, the cumulative effect was staggering. Nearly half of Japan's merchant fleet had been destroyed. Fuel shortages became critical, troop movements slowed, and equipment that should have arrived in the Pacific never reached the front lines. The Gato-class boats had transformed from underestimated toy submarines into strategic weapons capable of determining the outcome of a global conflict. In Tokyo and Truk, disbelief and frustration mounted. Commanders gathered to analyze the unprecedented losses. How could small boats, so seemingly insignificant, wreak such havoc? Reports painted a clear picture. America's industrial power, combined with tactical ingenuity and the daring of its submarine crews, had created an invisible but unstoppable force. Japan's empire, already stretched thin by overextension, was bleeding, quiet but rapid. The psychological impact was profound. Pride, confidence, and arrogance were replaced by anxiety and fear. The laughter that had echoed over the water at Truk Lagoon in 1941 was gone, replaced by grim faces and tense discussions of strategy, desperation, and survival. Meanwhile, beneath the waves, the Gato-class submariners continued their silent campaign. Every torpedo fired, every ship sunk, reinforced a broader narrative that even the smallest, most underestimated tools in the hands of disciplined, innovative men could alter the course of history. The contrast was striking. Massive battleships burning at Pearl Harbor, and yet these toy submarines were systematically dismantling the empire, one shipment at a time. The war's turning point, invisible to most, was happening quietly, beneath the waves, in darkness, far from the cameras and headlines that dominated the newspapers. By 1945, the effect of the submarine campaign was undeniable. Japan's logistical network was shattered. Industrial production could not compensate for the losses. Troops went hungry, ships remained immobile, and the empire's military operations stalled. The Gato-class boats had proven that the war was no longer won solely by grand fleets or decisive surface battles. It was also won in silence, through stealth, persistence, and a relentless focus on cutting the enemy's lifelines. The Japanese admirals, who once laughed at the small American submarines, had learned a bitter lesson. These toys had achieved what massive battleships could not. They strangled an empire without ever engaging in a traditional fleet battle. The irony was not lost on historians, who would later describe the Pacific submarine campaign as one of the most decisive yet understated factors in the Allied victory. As the final months of the war approached, the toll was unmistakable. Convoys were smaller, desperate, and heavily guarded. Yet for every escort sent, a Gato-class submarine lay in wait. By the end of the conflict, cumulative effect was catastrophic. Nearly 5 million tons of shipping destroyed, crippling Japan's ability to wage war. The toy submarines had lived up to their understated reputation, rewriting naval strategy and redefining the impact of small, precise, and relentless forces. The story of the Gato-class boats is a story of patience, ingenuity, and persistence. It is a story of how underestimation can become a fatal error, how arrogance can blind even the most powerful military forces, and how a handful of disciplined men in small, unassuming vessels can change the course of history. The laughter of Japanese admirals, so confident in 1941, stands as a stark reminder. In war, it is often the quiet, unseen forces, the shadows beneath the waves, that deliver the decisive blow. By mid-1944, the silent war beneath the waves had reached a crescendo. Every patrol, every torpedo fired was a thread in a larger strategy meticulously crafted by American naval planners. Intelligence from code-breaking
efforts, intercepted Japanese communications, and careful mapping of shipping lanes allowed the submariners to strike with precision. Convoys that had once moved with relative impunity were now walking into a shadowed trap. Captain Charles, or Swede Mumsen, and other submarine pioneers had envisioned this type of warfare years earlier, and now it was being executed on an unprecedented scale. Each Gato-class submarine, though small in comparison to the massive battleships that once dominated naval strategy, had become a predator in its own right, capable of changing the strategic calculus across the Pacific. On the bridges and in the command rooms of Japanese cruisers and battleships, disbelief was giving way to panic. Reports streamed in, tankers carrying vital oil vanished, supply ships destined for the Philippines or New Guinea never arrived, and troop transports carrying hundreds of soldiers disappeared beneath the waves without warning.
The term toy submarines was no longer whispered with amusement. It was muttered with fear. The same vessels that had been dismissed as inconsequential were now deciding the fate of entire campaigns, crippling Japan's ability to reinforce its garrisons or supply its forces. In the cramped control room of the USS Tang, Commander Richard O. Kane crouched over the periscope, his eyes straining to detect the outline of a freighter moving silently along the coast of the Philippines. The submarine's hull shuddered with the vibration of its own engines, and the scent of diesel and steel filled the air. The crew worked in unison, a finely tuned machine, where every hand and every command mattered. One wrong move, one hesitation, could mean detection and death. But their training, their discipline, and their nerves of steel allowed them to operate effectively in the most dangerous environment imaginable, the deep, cold, and dark Pacific, where even the faintest sound could betray their presence. O'Kane's moment came. The periscope revealed the target, a 10,000-ton Japanese tanker carrying much-needed fuel for the Imperial Navy. The torpedo tubes were loaded and a hush fell over the crew. 4 torpedoes fired in precise sequence, slicing through the water like invisible knives. Seconds later, explosions ripped through the tanker's hull. Flames erupted and black smoke twisted into the sky, signaling the success of the attack. The crew allowed themselves a brief, silent celebration before returning to their stations, knowing the work was far from over. Each sinking, each disruption compounded the strain on Japan's war effort. The cumulative effect of the submarine campaign was staggering. By late 1944, Japanese industry was straining under shortages of fuel, food, and raw materials. Troop movements slowed, aircraft could not be fueled for sorties, and entire strategic operations were postponed or canceled. The Imperial Navy's heavy surface units, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers could not counter this invisible menace. The ocean, which they had once thought of as their domain, had turned into a hunting ground for vessels they had once considered insignificant. Submarine operations were not limited to mere sinkings. They forced Japan to change convoy strategies, increase escort ships, and divert critical resources to anti-submarine warfare. Stretching their already overextended capabilities, Japanese supply lines were forced into zigzagging patterns, slowing the movement of fuel and ammunition. Ports were reinforced, and anti-submarine nets were deployed, yet the Gato-class boats continued to penetrate defenses with astonishing success. Each patrol revealed gaps in Japan's preparations, and each successful strike heightened the sense of dread among admirals who once laughed at the toy submarines. Even as Japan attempted to adapt, the technological and strategic advantages of the American submarines kept them ahead. Superior radar, sonar, and torpedo guidance systems allowed for attacks in near darkness, while the submariners' mastery of stealth and timing ensured minimal losses. The contrast between the massive surface fleets, which relied on traditional naval doctrines, and these small but agile submarines could not have been starker. It was a lesson in how innovation, discipline, and relentless execution could outweigh brute force, and Japan was learning it at the steepest possible cost. By the final months of the war, the devastation was undeniable. The once confident Japanese Navy was barely able to fuel its remaining ships, let alone mount effective operations across the Pacific. Merchant shipping losses had reached nearly half the pre-war tonnage, crippling the empire's ability to sustain its forces. Morale among commanders plummeted as they faced the grim reality that their naval superiority had been eroded not by fleet engagements or aerial bombardments, but by small, unassuming submarines operating with deadly precision. The very vessels that had been ridiculed and dismissed had reshaped the strategic landscape, illustrating that in modern warfare, the unseen, silent forces can often determine the outcome of battles before they are even fought. Throughout this campaign, the human element remained at the forefront. Each submarine patrol required extraordinary courage. The term toy submarines was no longer whispered with amusement, it was muttered with fear. The same vessels that had been dismissed as inconsequential were now deciding the fate of entire campaigns, crippling Japan's ability to reinforce its garrisons or supply its forces. In the cramped control room of the USS Tang, Commander Richard O. Kane crouched over the periscope, his eyes straining to detect the outline of a freighter moving silently along the coast of the Philippines. The submarine's hull shuddered with the vibration of its own engines, and the scent of diesel and steel filled the air. Crew worked in unison, a finely tuned machine, where every hand and every command mattered. One wrong move, one hesitation would mean detection and death. But their training, their discipline, and their nerves of steel allowed them to operate effectively in the most dangerous environment imaginable, the deep, cold, and dark Pacific, where even the faintest sound could betray their presence. O'Kane's moment came. The periscope revealed the target, a 10,000-ton Japanese tanker carrying much-needed fuel for the Imperial Navy. Torpedo tubes were loaded and a hush fell over the crew. 4 torpedoes fired in precise sequence, slicing through the water like invisible knives. Seconds later, explosions ripped through the tanker's hull. Flames erupted and black smoke twisted into the sky, signaling the success of the attack. The crew allowed themselves a brief, silent celebration before returning to their stations, knowing the work was far from over. Each sinking, each disruption compounded the strain on Japan's war effort. The cumulative effect of the submarine campaign was staggering. By late 1944, Japanese industry was straining under shortages of fuel, food, and raw materials. Troop movements slowed, aircraft could not be fueled for sorties, and entire strategic operations were postponed or canceled. The Imperial Navy's heavy surface units, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers could not counter this invisible menace. The ocean, which they had once thought of as their domain, had turned into a hunting ground for vessels they had once considered insignificant. Submarine operations were not limited to mere sinkings. They forced Japan to change convoy strategies, increase escort ships, and divert critical resources to anti-submarine warfare. Stretching their already overextended capabilities, Japanese supply lines were forced into zigzagging patterns, slowing the movement of fuel and ammunition.